The war left Silas Kirk, Weatherby 41 years old, and utterly alone, a man who had once commanded the respect of a Wyoming township, now sleeping in the hollow of a burned-out grain shed, because no boarding house in Larkspur Hollow would take a man who woke screaming in the night. It was his own brother, Jonah, who turned him out ashamed of what people said, ashamed of the war that had followed Silas home like a shadow that would not lie down. All Silas owned in this world was $11, a canteen, and a coat gone thin at the elbows. And so it was, in the bitter dawn of a Tuesday in March of 1889, that a woman found him half frozen against her fence post and did not send him away, but instead pointed to the sagging, rat-eaten barn behind her modest farmhouse and said he could sleep there if he was willing to mend it. What neither of them knew that morning was that inside the walls of that condemned old barn lay a secret buried, nearly 20 years one that would not only mend a broken soldier, but restore an entire town that had quietly starved itself of the one thing it needed most: forgiveness. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Silas Weatherby and the widow named Ruth Calloway who put him back together. If you have ever loved someone the war changed, or been changed by a war yourself, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Silas Weatherby had not always been a man who flinched at the sound of a slamming door. He was born in 1848 in a modest farmhouse outside Cheyenne, the second son of a blacksmith named Amos Weatherby, a broad-shouldered, quiet man who believed that character was forged the same way iron was through heat, through pressure, and through the patience to let a thing cool properly before you judged its shape. Amos had two sons, Jonah and Silas, and though they shared a mother's soft eyes and a father's stubborn jaw, they could not have grown into more different men. Jonah was ambitious from boyhood, quick to see an opportunity. But then came 1861, and the war took the shape of every young man's future and bent it without asking permission. Silas enlisted not out of any grand conviction about the Union or the Confederacy, for Wyoming territory sat far enough from the fighting that such convictions felt abstract, but because a recruiter passed through Cheyenne promising steady pay, and Silas, watching his father's forge struggle through a lean year, thought of it as a son's duty to lighten the load at home. Jonah did not enlist. Jonah stayed, and in staying built. He took over management of a freight company that supplied army posts along the frontier, and by the time Silas returned from 4 years of war, Jonah had become a man of considerable means, owner of 3 warehouses and a controlling interest in the very bank that held the mortgage on their father's forge. What Silas carried home from the war was not the same as what Jonah had built. He had served under a Colonel Ashford in a cavalry unit that saw fighting in Missouri and later in skirmishes further south, and though he rarely spoke of specifics even in later years, those who served near him said that Silas Weatherby was a man who ran toward the wounded when every instinct screamed to run the other way, and that he had once carried 2 fellow soldiers across a half-mile of open field under fire, one slung over each shoulder, and had wept for 3 days afterward when both of them died anyway. The war did not make Silas a coward. It made him a man whose nerves had been rubbed raw as exposed wire, so that a dropped plate could send him diving beneath a table, so that darkness itself sometimes felt like a held breath he could not release. In 1889, men did not yet have a name for what haunted him. They simply called him strange or broken, or in the crueler corners of town a man not to be trusted around decent people. His father had died in 1874, and the forge passed jointly to the 2 brothers, though it was Jonah who held the paper. On it through the bank, a fact that would matter more than Silas understood at the time. For nearly 15 years after the war, Silas drifted through a kind of half-life working the forge when his hands were steady enough, disappearing for weeks into the high country when they were not, never marrying, never quite settling, a man the town of Larkspur Hollow regarded the way one regards a lightning-struck tree still standing in a field. Impressive once, faintly dangerous now, better given a wide berth. And Ruth Calloway, in those same years, had married a rancher named Thomas Calloway, a decent, unremarkable man who gave her a modest spread of land 8 miles outside town, and then, in the autumn of 1886, was thrown from a horse and died 3 days later of injuries no doctor in the territory could mend. Ruth was 39 when she buried him, left with 200 acres of middling grazing land, a debt she had not known existed until the funeral costs came due, and a barn so old it had been condemned by the county surveyor the year before her husband's death, its beams gray and split, its roof caved in on the north corner where a windstorm had torn through in 1885. Ruth had not torn it down only because she could not afford to, and had not repaired it because repair cost more than the barn itself was worth. It simply sat there year after year, a monument to a problem she had decided to stop thinking about. The particular cruelty of Silas Weatherby's fall came not from the war itself, but from what his brother did in the years the war's damage quietly deepened. Jonah Weatherby had never been an unkind man in the ordinary sense. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand, but he was a man who believed, with the same firmness their father once believed in the honesty of iron, that a business must be protected from anything that threatened its reputation. And by 1888, Silas had become, in Jonah's eyes, exactly such a threat. There had been an incident that spring at the freight company's warehouse, where Silas had gone to ask his brother for a small loan to repair a wagon axle, and a stack of crates had been dropped nearby by a careless teamster, and the sound had sent Silas to the floor with his arms over his head, shaking, unable to rise for nearly 10 minutes while 3 of Jonah's clients stood watching in uncomfortable silence. Jonah had said nothing to Silas that day, but helped him up and sent him home in a hired buggy. It was 2 weeks later that the letter came, typed on bank stationery, informing Silas that his portion of the Forge's mortgage payment was now in arrears, and that the bank, Jonah's bank, required immediate settlement or the property would revert entirely to Jonah's ownership. Silas did not have the money. He had never had much money. Whatever wages he earned from odd blacksmith work went to keep himself fed and his tools in repair, and the war pension he was owed had been delayed by paperwork for over a year with no resolution in sight. When the Forge was seized that winter, Jonah did not evict his brother from the town. He simply stopped inviting him to family gatherings, stopped acknowledging him at the mercantile, and let it be quietly known among the town's more genteel families that Silas Weatherby was unstable, that his presence unsettled decent folk, that a man given to fits and tremors ought not be trusted near children or livestock. It was not an official banishment. It was worse, a slow closing of doors, one after another, until Silas found that every boarding house in Larkspur Hollow had suddenly no vacancy when he came asking, that every odd job dried up the moment his name was mentioned, that even the church pews seemed to empty a little wider around him on the Sundays he still tried to attend. By the time the frost came hard in February of 1889, Silas Weatherby was sleeping in Wateeve. Shelter he could find a hollowed grain shed on the town's edge, an abandoned line shack, once even a culvert beneath the county road surviving on $11 he had managed to keep hidden in his boot, a sum he protected as fiercely as a soldier protects the last of his ammunition, because he understood, with the flat clarity of a man who has lost everything else, that it was all that stood between him and simply lying down in the snow and not getting up again. It was on one such morning, gray and bitter, with frost etched thick across every fence rail in the valley, that Ruth Calloway rode out to check her northern boundary line and found a man collapsed against her cedar post fence, his coat crusted with ice, his lips moving in some silent conversation with people who were not there. She did not know him at first. 15 years, and considerable suffering had aged Silas Weatherby well past his true years, but something in the shape of his jaw, some echo of the quiet boy who used to sharpen her father's plow blades without ever quite meeting her eyes, made her dismount instead of riding on. She built a small fire before she even tried to speak to him, understanding instinctively that warmth had to come before words, and when at last his eyes cleared enough to focus on her face, he said only, "Ruth Calloway," as though confirming to himself that the world still contained one true thing. She did not take him into her house. A widow living alone could not, in a town like Larkspur Hollow, invite a strange man across her threshold without inviting a scandal that would outlast any kindness. But she looked past him at the old barn slouching on its ruined foundation and made him an offer that surprised them both. She had $11 of her own hidden in a tin behind the flour bin, saved slowly against some unnamed emergency, and she told him she would give him 3 of those dollars for whatever work he could manage, and in exchange he could sleep in a barn, mend what he was able, and eat what she could spare from her table without ever crossing into the house itself. It was not charity, she told him firmly, seeing the flicker of shame cross his face. It was a fair trade, plain and simple, the same as any other business arrangement between two people who each had something the other needed. Silas, who had learned in 15 years of drifting exactly how rare such fairness was, accepted before she had finished speaking. The first night he slept in that barn, wrapped in a horse blanket Ruth had left folded on a nail by the door, Silas noticed something that a less observant man would have missed entirely. The north wall, the one damaged by the 1885 windstorm, had been patched at some point long before Ruth's husband ever owned the property, patched not with fresh lumber, but with a section of wall salvage from somewhere else entirely, the grain of the wood running a different direction than the board around it. The nail heads a different pattern, older, hand-forged rather than machine-cut. Silas had spent his boyhood reading the language of iron and would the way other men read newspapers. And something about that patched section nagged at him through his first restless sleep in that cold barn. Some sense that a piece of the wall did not belong to the story the rest of the structure was telling. It took him 4 days of careful, quiet work clearing rotted straw, resetting fallen beams, patching the roof where he could with materials Ruth allowed him to salvage from a collapsed shed near the property line before his hands were steady enough and his curiosity strong enough to investigate that odd patch of wall more closely. When he finally pried back one loose board, working slowly so as not to bring the whole section down, he found that the wall was not solid at all behind that patch. There was a cavity, narrow but deliberate, built into the frame itself, and within it, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now brittle and yellowed with age, he found a small wooden box no larger than a Bible, and inside the box, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon gone the color of weak tea, and beneath the letters, a folded map hand-drawn in ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. Silas did not open the letters that first evening. He sat with the box in his lap for a long while, listening to the wind work at the barn's remaining gaps, feeling the particular weight that comes from holding something that clearly was never meant to be found by accident. When at last he untied the ribbon and unfolded the topmost letter, he found it addressed not to any name he recognized, but simply to whoever finds this in God's good time, and it was dated the 14th of September, 1868, 21 years before that cold winter he now found himself in. The letter was written in a careful, educated hand, and as Silas read it by the thin light of a lantern Ruth had left him, he understood he was reading the confession of a man named Josiah Hartwell, who had once been the town of Larkspur Hollow's assayer and the trusted keeper of the small mining claims registry for the modest gold operations that had briefly flickered through the region in the years just after the war. Hartwell wrote that in 1867, a flash flood had swept through the settlement's original records office, and in the chaos and confusion of that disaster, he alone had managed to save the claims ledger, the single document proving which families held legal title to which mining parcels along Cutter's Creek. Parcels that, though the gold had largely petered out by then, still carried water rights that would prove, in later decades, to be worth a considerable fortune as the valley shifted from prospecting toward ranching and irrigation. But Hartwell confessed that in the chaos of that flood, he had done something he had spent the rest of his life regretting. Rather than restore the ledger to public record, he had quietly altered it, transferring 3 of the most valuable water-adjacent claims into his own name and the names of 2 associates, believing wrongly, as it turned out that the original claimants had died in the flood along with so many others in the settlement's low-lying quarter. He had grown modestly wealthy from those stolen claims over the following year, wealthy enough to build the very barn Silas now sat inside, back when this land had belonged to Hartwell himself before it passed through 2 subsequent owners to Ruth's late husband. But Hartwell wrote that he had since learned that one family believed lost in the flood the Okafors, formerly enslaved people who had come west after the war and staked a legitimate claim along the creek's eastern bend, had in fact survived, having been away at a church gathering in Cheyenne the week of the disaster, and had returned to find their claim simply gone from the record, their name erased as though they had never existed. Silas read that letter 3 times before the lantern guttered low. and when he finally set it down, his hands were not shaking from the old war tremor that plagued him, but from something else, entirely the recognition that he was holding, quite literally, the buried truth of an injustice that had shaped the entire economic order of Larkspur Hollow for over 2 decades. An injustice that had enriched certain families and quietly erased another, and that fate, or God, or simple blind chance had placed this truth in the hands of a man the town had already decided was worthless. He told Ruth the next morning. Over coffee, she brought out to the barn door rather than inviting him inside, and he watched her face move through disbelief, then careful calculation, then something that looked almost like grief, because she recognized the name Okafor recalled dimly a family that had lived on the creek's eastern bend when she was a girl and had simply vanished from the town's memory sometime in her childhood. The kind of quiet erasure that happens to people no one thinks to ask questions about. Ruth was no fool. She understood immediately what such a discovery might mean. And she understood, too, the danger of it, because the current owner of the largest ranch along that same creek bend, a prosperous cattleman named Garrett Thorne, held water rights across that very parcel that had made his operation the most profitable in the valley. Water rights that traced their legal legitimacy directly back to Josiah Hartwell's forged transfer of 1868. It did not take long for word to travel that something had been found in the widow Calloway's old barn. Silas had gone into town to inquire, carefully and without revealing too much, whether anyone remembered a family named Okafor, and the mere asking of the question was enough to reach Garrett Thorne's ears within 2 days, carried by a clerk at the land office who owed Thorne certain favors. Thorne came to Ruth's farm himself on a gray afternoon in late March, dismounting from a horse considerably finer than anything Ruth owned, and he did not raise his voice or make any overt threat, but he spoke to her with the particular condescension of a man accustomed to being obeyed, suggesting that whatever old papers a broken, unreliable man like Silas Weatherby claimed to have found were surely worthless. Forgeries themselves, perhaps, or the ramblings of a mind the war had left, permanently unsound, and that it would go easier for everyone, including Ruth herself, whose mortgage note, he mentioned almost in passing, happened to be held by the very same bank that Jonah Weatherby controlled if such foolishness were simply forgotten. The threat was not subtle once Ruth understood it. Thorne was reminding her, without quite saying so, that her own modest farm could be made to disappear through the same quiet financial pressures that had already destroyed Silas, that Jonah Weatherby's bank held power over half the town's small landholders, and that a woman alone, harboring a man already whispered about as dangerous and unstable, made an easy target for whatever pressure a man of Thorne's standing cared to apply. Ruth did not answer him that day beyond a cold, level assurance that she would think on what he'd said. And after he rode away, she found Silas standing just inside the barn door, having heard every word, his jaw tight, his hands she noticed not trembling at all, steadier than she had yet seen them. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation, but a careful, deliberate campaign of quiet verification, the kind of patient work that suited a man who had once learned to read the truth hidden inside a piece of heated iron. Silas and Ruth spent the following weeks tracing whatever remained of the Okafor family's history, writing letters to the county recorder's office in Cheyenne, to a church congregation in the territory that kept careful records of its traveling members, and eventually, through a chain of correspondence that took nearly a month to bear fruit, they located a woman named Delilah Okafor Fairweather, granddaughter of the original claimants, now living with her own family in a small farming community 2 counties away, entirely unaware that her grandparents' vanished claim had ever existed in any recorded form, believing only the family story passed down that they had simply been cheated by the flood. When Delilah Fairweather traveled to Larkspur Hollow that May, brought by Ruth's careful letters and a small sum of travel money Ruth insisted on providing despite her own tight circumstances, she arrived with her husband and 2 grown sons, and she carried herself with a dignity that made even the town's more skeptical citizens fall quiet when she walked into the land office holding the original ledger pages Silas had found, pages that matched, in Hartwell's own careful hand, the boundaries on the map found beside them. Garrett Thorne did not go quietly. He hired a lawyer from Laramie, who argued technicalities of adverse possession and the passage of time, who suggested that whatever wrong had been done in 1868 was too old to remedy now, that the law favored settled expectations over ancient grievances. But the county recorder, a scrupulous man named Judge Amos Pemberton, who had no particular loyalty to Thorne and considerable respect for documented evidence, ruled that a fraudulently altered public record could not create legitimate title no matter how many years had passed, and that the Okafor claim, along with its attached water rights, belonged rightfully to Delilah Fairweather and her descendants. It was not simple vengeance that Silas and Ruth sought once the ruling came down. And this is the part of the story that mattered most to everyone who later heard it told. Delilah Fairweather, upon regaining her family's rightful water rights, did not seek to ruin Garrett Thorne or drive him from the valley in the manner he had tried to drive out others. Instead, at Ruth's quiet suggestion and with Silas standing beside her, Delilah proposed something the town had not seen before: a shared irrigation agreement that would extend water access not only to her own restored parcel, but to several smaller struggling farms along the creek that had suffered for years under Thorne's controlled distribution. Farms including, notably, Ruth Calloway's own modest spread. Thorne, facing the loss of his most profitable water claim entirely, agreed to the arrangement rather than risk losing everything in a longer legal fight. And though he remained a diminished figure in Larkspur Hollow from that season forward, quietly excluded from the town council seat he had long assumed was his by right, he was not ruined, only humbled, which Ruth said afterward was justice enough, the kind that corrects a wrong without creating a new one. Jonah Weatherby's reckoning came more quietly still, and in its way more completely, for when word spread through Larkspur Hollow of what his brother had uncovered a wrong 2 decades old, righted through patience and honesty rather than force, the town's opinion of Silas began, slowly, to turn. It became known, too, exactly how Silas had come to be sleeping in a grain shed that winter, and exactly whose quiet campaign of exclusion had put him there. And Jonah found that the clients and associates who had once respected his caution regarding his unstable brother now regarded him with a wariness of their own, understanding at last that the caution had been convenience dressed as concern. Jonah did not apologize in any grand public fashion. Men like him rarely do. But he sent, that autumn, a formal letter releasing all claim to their father's forge, along with a modest sum representing what he privately acknowledged was Silas's fair share of the freight company's profits across the years the mortgage dispute had cost him his trade. It was not warmth, but it was, Silas said, enough. And so it was at the same barn which had sheltered a broken soldier through the last hard weeks of a Wyoming winter became, by summer, something else entirely, not merely mended, but transformed, its salvaged beams now framing a modest forge Silas rebuilt with his own steady hands. The ring of hammer on iron, once again a familiar sound along that stretch of creek, a sound the town had assumed lost for good. Ruth watched him work some evenings from her kitchen window. This man she had once walked fence lines with as a girl of 16, now a man remade, not by forgetting the war, but by finally being trusted to carry its weight somewhere safe. The $11 that had once stood between Silas Weatherby and the snow, the $3 Ruth had once offered for honest work and a place to sleep, had grown into something neither of them could have priced that frozen March morning: a restored family's rightful claim, a mended forge, a town's quiet correction of an old debt, and between the widow and the soldier, though neither rushed to name it, a partnership built the same patient way Amos Weatherby once said good iron was made. Through heat, through pressure, and through the willingness to let a thing find its true shape in its own time. We began this story by telling you that a broken soldier bought nothing at all that winter. Only $11 stood between him and the frost, and it was a widow's fence post, not a purchase, that changed his fate. Silas Weatherby did not go looking for a hidden ledger or a stolen claim. He went looking only for a dry place to sleep and a little dignity in a world that had decided he had none left to offer. But that is so often how restoration comes to those who deserve it, not through grand plans, but through one small kindness extended to a person everyone else had already written off. Ruth Calloway saw a man worth mending in a barn everyone else had already condemned, and in mending both, she uncovered a truth that mended a whole community besides. That is the quiet arithmetic of this valley, and perhaps of every valley like it. Overlooked things, given patience and honest attention, so rarely stay overlooked forever. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Silas and Ruth tonight. If their story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that broken things are so often waiting only for someone patient enough to see their true shape. We'd love to know, has there ever been a time when you found real worth in something or someone that everyone else had already given up on? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.